And good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Janus and the board, for the invitation. And Catherine, I don't know if she's still here. I think she's gone to her bat mitzvah. But thanks to her for welcoming us into this wonderful building, law school. So what I want to talk about is essentially try to help us understand what a bad mess we're in and how we got here when it comes to sexual prevention policy in this country. And I'll also talk a little bit about how I think we can move beyond it. But I do think that unless we understand it, and what kind of gives it its sticking power and its social power, then we don't have, we won't be very successful in trying to move beyond it and get more effective and more humane policies. Because right now, our policies are neither humane, nor effective, nor constitutional, nor respectful of either victims of sexual violence or people who've been convicted in the past. So a couple of preliminary matters. I think that the language we use matters a lot. How we use language matters a lot. I don't like the word sex offender, but I do use that term sometimes in my presentation. So I just would flag that to begin with. I don't think we've come up necessarily with a term that, or a way of describing people who are subjected to these laws. So just be aware of the fact that I understand that when we identify people as sex offenders, we're already saying a lot about what their personality is, what their constituent is, and what kind of a person they are, and all those things are quite harmful, I think. Second, let me just give you a little bit of an idea about my involvement in this area of law. I started out in the 1970s as a legal aid lawyer in Minnesota, right after law school. And I began doing a lot of work representing people with mental illnesses, particularly in civil commitment. And my sense of justice was outraged by how those folks were being treated, and I developed an expertise in civil commitment. Fast forward 20 years to the early 90s, and the state of Minnesota, state of Washington, a couple of other states began to resurrect this idea that you could use civil commitment as a way of locking up people after their terms of prison were finished on the grounds that they continued to be dangerous. And this, again, offended my sense of justice. These laws, these psychopath laws, always had struck me as very un-American and very dangerous laws. And so I was pleased in the early 90s then to be asked to represent a very notorious man who was being released from prison after 27 years in Minnesota, and who was among the first people in Minnesota to be petitioned for civil commitment. And along with a friend and colleague of mine, I represented Dennis Linehan for 10 years, challenging the constitutionality of Minnesota's sex offender civil commitment law. And although we had some successes at the beginning, in the end, we lost that battle. And the Minnesota Sex Offender Program continues today and is a model for the defects in this approach to dealing with sexual violence prevention. So I want to start with what I think we all agree on, and that is that sexual violence, sexual assault is serious, harmful. It's more common than we would like to think. Second, that our policies, and this is what I hope to expound on, are misdirected. They're based on myth. They're ineffective. They have unintended, or maybe intended, and perverse consequences, and they're harmful and inhumane. Mostly I want to focus on where we are now and how we got here and how we can design better policies. Again, we know that the rate of sexual violence is fairly high. fairly high percentage, a disturbingly high percentage of both men and women have at some point in their lives been victimized in a sexual way. Mostly, what we know is that this is not stranger violence, it's intimate violence and acquaintance violence. Almost all, great majority of sexual harms are committed by people known to the victim. Our current policies designed to address sexual offending or sexual harms fall, and here I'm speaking nationally, not simply having to do with California, although I think these descriptions are obviously applicable here as well, kind of fall into three categories. Long sentences and supervision, then this notion of civil commitment, locking people up in a so-called treatment center after their prison sentence is completed, and then a whole system of what we might think of as virtual confinement. Sorry. He was going to provide the answer to that. Maybe that's the problem, we just haven't asked. Then we have a system, I think, that we can't really understand any other way than virtual confinement or prison without bars. Sex offender registration notification laws, banishment laws or presence restrictions, and other sets of behavioral restrictions. Our current policies are reactionary. They are not thought out in a comprehensive way. They are reactions to horrific crimes, almost without exception. They are atheoretical. They're not based on some understanding of what sexual violence is like, what causes people to sexually offend. So they're not based on any notion of intervention that is associated with some theoretical understanding. They're interstitial, that is to say, they're based on a theory that we can plug this hole and plug that hole and plug that hole and do something, interstitial rather than comprehensive. They're non-empirical. They never were based on an empirical understanding of sexual offending, and they're non-comprehensive. Again, they're not enacted with any thought in mind that an action here may have a consequence here, and that we ought to be thinking about how the whole system works in order to design a sensible system of prevention. So a key question for me has always been, how did we get here? A key answer often is through the process of moral panic. And moral panic, sociological term, defined as a mass hysteria generated by exploiting people's worst fears, often for the sake of underlying political agenda. And I don't think there's any question that what we've experienced over the last 20 to 30 years in this area is a moral panic in that sense. But that only provides part of the explanation for how we got here. Because it doesn't explain why now and why this subject you have a moral panic about, as opposed to, for example, global climate change. So why this and why now? And why has it been so sticky? Janus talked about tipping points, Malcolm Gladwell. Another of his concepts is this idea of the stickiness of ideas. Some ideas are sticky, they stick around for a long time. And these ideas underlying these sex offender laws have stickiness. So why now? Why so sticky? And maybe if we start to understand that, we can try to address how we can get unstuck. So, very short history of how we got here. For many, many years, rape law, and I look at this from a legal perspective, obviously, but rape laws and criminal justice practices were shaped in large measure by rape myths, a series of myths about what real rape was and what rape really was about. These are myths. I won't go into them except a little bit, but they reflected a certain view of the proper role for women and the nature of sexuality in men. Over a period of years, we had a series of feminist-inspired reforms. These reforms focused on a number of different things, of course, but in part, they addressed rape laws. And we had a series of, again, feminist-inspired reforms in the area of rape law and criminal justice practices. These included redefinitions of rape and sexual assault, basically a broadening of those notions, doing away with some of the old ideas of rape, such as that the victim had to physically struggle in order for it to count as rape. New understandings of rape and sexual assault, extending the notion beyond kind of the classic definition of forcible rape to broader categories of sexual assault, non-consensual or power-based assault. Key changes in how victims are treated or are supposed to be treated in the criminal justice system to avoid re-victimizing victims as they go through this system. And in many ways, these changes, they certainly were significant. In many ways, they have been successful, although certainly not entirely so. But these new regulatory laws that we're talking about, the civil commitment and registries and so forth, they're not criminal laws, they're regulatory. They assert that they are civil laws, non-punitive. They began to take root in the early 90s. And I mentioned what these are. So we can focus on these myths for a minute because although the feminist reforms focused on a number of rape myths and were very important for that regard, these myths are dangerous. Here we see that these myths are not dead. This notion that Christine Blasey Ford shouldn't be believed because it took her quite a while to report, and if this had really happened to her, her parents would have called the authorities at the time. And we know, of course, that that is a myth and a harmful one. So there were a series of these myths, and the feminist reformers challenged those rape myths. And those challenges were viewed as a challenge to the patriarchy. Now, here I want to go into this a little bit because I think, for me anyway, this helps explain where the power comes from behind these laws. So the feminists challenged established male power. And by the patriarchy, I don't mean a conspiracy or an organized conspiracy to keep men in power, but rather the basic foundations of our society and our civilization. So, and these challenges of the feminist views about sexual assault played into the broader cultural wars about the appropriate roles for gender and sexuality in particular. So the feminist view that underlay their reform efforts was that sexual violence is ubiquitous in society, number one. Number two, and this is key, that social norms allow it to flourish. And by the way, we see that recently when it comes to places like Penn State, Ohio State, Catholic Church, various institutions that have protected sexual abusers over the years. So societal norms allow it to flourish, and that women and children are most at risk in domestic and familiar settings, most at risk statistically. The traditional view, on the other hand, is that sexual violence is stranger violence. Women and children are safest at home under the protection of the family, read the man, and that sexual violence is aberrational and abnormal. So the key difference is that for feminists, when talking about sexual violence, they would characterize the problem as us, the larger society, that we have not adapted, changed our societal norms to indicate a clear disapproval of the kind of sexual violence that is allowed to flourish. For the traditional view, the feminist view is a challenge to traditional values and norms. And the traditional view says the problem is not us, it's them. So we have a fundamental kind of disconnect between the reformers, the feminists, and traditionalists. And in some ways, that disconnect starts to show up in very graphic ways in the early 90s. For example, in the hearings involving Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas, where she accused him of sexual harassment. And of course, what we saw was the ranks of the powerful, mostly white men on the Senate Judiciary Committee closing ranks around him and protecting him against those accusations. Of course, we've seen that most recently again with the Kavanaugh hearings. So to me, that represents the feminist challenge to the patriarchy. And it's at the same time then that we start to get these regulatory reforms. So 1988 in Minnesota, Commitment Act Task Force starts to recommend that, and 88, 89, 90 in Minnesota, and Washington, we start to get these recommendations that we use these regulatory means to address sexual violence. And what I am going to suggest is that these regulatory laws that we now are coping with are really a pushback, a safe pushback against the feminist challenge to the patriarchy. So these regulatory laws, I will suggest, are all based on the notion that if sexual violence is ubiquitous, as you feminists say it is, it's really not all of us who are responsible. It's that little group of people over there that's responsible. And if we just identify that group and get them away from us, we will have taken care of the problem. So we all know about the myths. So right around this time, we start to get these notions that it is raining perverts, that perverts are all over the place. Notice, not sexual violence, but perverts. We get headlines like this: molesters often strike again. And listen to this. It's all too frequent that the perpetrator in such cases is a pathological sexual predator. All too frequent. It happens all the time, so we're starting to generate a model of what sexual violence is really like, and it's the pathological predator. It happens all the time, and here's the key. The dangerous ones have a high recidivism rate, which is a little like saying almost all fatal car accidents involve a death. And then, of course, we get the Smith versus Doe, the frightening and high line that we've heard about, that Ira and Tara have written so eloquently about, that then gets replicated hundreds of times throughout the cases. And the notion is that sex offenders have an extremely high rate of recidivism. So, I want to focus for a little bit on this frightening and high myth, because as we know, it's a myth, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's not just any myth. It's not just a mistake. It's a mistake that has central consequences for the laws that are developed and for how we think about them. Because the frightening and high myth really creates the sex offender as a monster. So the reasoning goes something like this. Almost all sex offenders will repeat their offenses. Therefore, therefore, sex offenders are wired differently. And that's critical, because the whole notion, of course, of punishment is that you punish somebody in order for them not to do something again, to learn a lesson. And if these people never learn their lesson, despite harsh punishment, they must be different from us. They're wired differently. They're not rational. So, sexual violence is a problem caused by abnormal psychology or biology. Abnormal psychology. It's a key, because again, it suggests difference in kind. These are different kind of people. They have a different psychology, probably can't change. And critically, it's not us, it's them. We can locate the problem inside the head of that offender, rather than in a society that permits sexual harm to go unaccounted for. So sex offenders are the other, they're monsters. That leads to a stranger danger model, the notion that the true danger is not from normal people, it's from monsters. And finally, to the consequence, to the conclusion that in order to deal with this, because we as a society don't like this, appropriately so, but to deal with it, what we have to do is identify those dangerous people and separate them, move them out of range so they can't hurt us. So those are the consequences of this frightening and high myth. But there's some other consequences as well that really shape where we are today. So think about this. The myth is almost all sex offenders recidivate. They almost all commit another sex offense. So if we know who our current sex offenders are, and we're interested in prevention, who are our future sex offenders? Well, if almost all sex offenders recidivate, then almost all of the future sex offenders are current sex offenders. So that tells us, I mean, the logic there is, again, we should be focusing, if we're worried about sexual violence, we should be focusing on recidivism. That's the key focus. Now, that, among other things, are key mistakes that our current policy is based on. So what I want to do is just walk through 6 or so of those key errors, some of which I'm sure, or maybe all of which are familiar. But all of these are consequences of that frightening and high myth. So first of all, we know the frightening and high myth, of course, is incorrect. Sex offenders commit new sexual crimes at fairly low rates. One of the iconic studies in 1994 suggested 5% on a 3-year follow-up. Some people criticized that because there's only a 3-year follow-up, and now we have a 9-year follow-up from the Department of Justice, which says that in 9 years, 92% of folks released from prison on a sex offense charge do not commit another sex offense. Sex offenders were less likely to be rearrested for any charge than other released prisoners during that 9-year period. So that's kind of the first myth, that the frightening and high is way, way, way off. Second, measured recidivism rates have actually declined over the years. So this is from Minnesota. So whatever the recidivism rates might have been 20 years ago, those rates have declined markedly over the years. Number 3, this is a point that Professor Ellman makes eloquently in his amicus briefs. Recidivism risk is not average for most sex offenders, and this for a great number of reasons. Even those measured recidivism rates that I just referred to, that 5% or 9%, or 8%, those are averages for people being released from prison. And we know that folks being released from prison or otherwise coming out of the criminal justice system are heterogeneous. A lot of different risk levels. Among other things, risk decreases with age. It's well established in criminologically in general, and in particular among people convicted of sex offenses. Key, then, in more recent research is that risk declines with time offense-free in the community. Carl Hansen and his colleagues published several important studies showing that even for sex offenders identified as high risk, those that live in the community for a period of years without reoffending, after a certain number of years, their risk to reoffend approaches baseline. Obviously, that has, or should have, great relevance in designing policies about how to best use our prevention resources. And here's the part that I think is maybe the most important piece. Remember, I said that one of the consequences of the frightening and high myth is that almost all future sex offenders are current sex offenders because they almost all reoffend. So you have this serial predator model that most sexual violence comes from a few people that we can just find them and put them away, will be okay. But in fact, of course, almost all sex offending is committed by people who were not previously apprehended for sex offenses. And we can look at that in a whole bunch of different angles. Most people in prison for sex offenses are not first-time sex offenders. Most recidivist sexual violence is not committed by released sex offenders. I mean, if you're worried about sexual violence, which we all should be, by released prisoners, 84% of it is committed by people who are not in prison for a sex crime. Most sex offense convictions are first-time offenders. Convictions, 93% of those convicted never had a sex crime in their past. And most, even arrests, are first-time offenders, 95%. So the consequence of all of this is that the serial predator model is wrong. It's just not descriptive of the nature of sexual violence in our country. Recidivist violence is a small sliver of sexual harm. So where does this serial predator model lead us? This notion that there are, a small group of people who are responsible for most of the sexual harm. Well, number one, it has caused our main focus in setting policy to be on recidivism. Now, I'm not suggesting that recidivism is unimportant or we should focus on it, but to suggest through our rhetoric and our policies that it is the most important thing is wrong and harmful. Why? Because it forces our vision away from the great bulk of sexual harm. It forces our vision downstream after the harm has happened, where we think we can put the horse back in the barn, instead of upstream dealing with root causes and more conventional approaches. And by this way, it casts the majority of sexual violence into the shadows. If our notion is that real sexual violence is the sexual predator model, then we stop thinking about the great bulk of sexual harm that takes place that doesn't fit into that model. And just as important, and in a way, this is a symptom, it creates this idea of the degraded other. The notion that the sex offender is different, and, although it's never quite stated this way, not a full citizen, and underlying most of the reasoning is that the pain of people in that category, their rights don't matter. And that's a direct consequence of all of these myths and the way they've been developed. So this serial predator model, again, puts our focus on a small, tiny fragment of sexual harm going on. Well, I was going to make a comment about Willie Sutton, who famously said, if you want to rob, what did he say? If you want money, you should go where the money is. That's why I rob banks. Well, if you want to address sexual violence, then you should be focused on where the sexual violence is, and that's not on recidivist violence. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, just kind of review where we've gotten to. We have long-term confinement. I think we all know that we have long sentences and supervision. In Minnesota, for example, from 1988 to 2017, the pronounced sentences for first-degree criminal sexual conduct rose from 75 months to 190 months. The mean sentence for rape and other sexual violence, so the top two lines, is much higher than the mean sentence for other violent crime, which is the bottom blue line. And as you can see, although the line for other violent crimes, the bottom line, is relatively flat, the line for punishment for sex offenses has been going up steadily over the years. Janus handled a lot of this really well. Some of the outrageous things that are going on in various states, move over that. We'll talk about civil commitment a little bit. We now have civil commitment in 20 jurisdictions, including California. There are about, depending on how it's counted, somewhere around 5,500, 6,000 people now locked up, post-criminal sentences in places like Coalinga, here in California, Moose Lake in Minnesota. Many of these people have been there for decades. A fair proportion of them committed a crime only when they were juveniles. Registration and notification, we've heard about that. We treat people like nuclear waste, basically. We see a growing influence of registration. The blue line here is people in prison for sex offenses. The orange bar is on the registry. Huge growing proportion of people on the registry. The blue line shows the percent of that the registered sex offender population is of the total percentage of people incarcerated. So that registration group as a percent of everybody under criminal incarceration is going up. We have a set of behavioral controls, again, mostly banishment controls we've heard about, others such as driver's licenses, license plates, and so forth. Okay. So the question is, are these policies working? And obviously, if we were being careful, we'd stop and ask, well, what do we mean by working? What do we hope to accomplish? If the answer is shaming and causing a lot of pain for people, then the answer is clearly yes, they are working. But I don't think that's what we ought to have as purposes for these laws. These laws ought to be addressed to reducing the level of sexual harm in the country. So there's not a lot of studies on this. There are a couple, but this is my own chart here showing the cumulative changes over time of rape and violent crime. And we could spend some time analyzing this, but what I see out of this is that while both violent crime and rape have basically gone down over the period 1990 to 2017, that's basically the time when we've had these laws, rape has gone down less slowly than other violent crime and is going back up. So that, I mean, obviously there could be a lot of factors there. I don't put too much into it, but that raises a question in my mind about the efficacy of these laws. As I said, there are only a few, and we want to distinguish between two questions. One question, the one that's almost always asked, is, do these laws decrease recidivism? That's important, but as I've said, recidivism is a small part of the problem. So a reduction in recidivism really doesn't make very much of a difference in the overall problem of sexual violence. What we really ought to be worried about is, have we brought down the level of sexual violence, of rape, sexual assault? And one key study, and Ira may know of others that I know of, where they looked very carefully at this over time and statistically crunched a whole bunch of numbers, and the answer was no. These laws don't show a correlation with any kind of reduction in the incidence of rape in our society. Why? Well, obviously, in my mind, it's because these are designed incorrectly. They're theoretical. They're not based on what we really know. And they misdirect our attention. They absolve us of responsibility by saying that we can take care of the problem by moving a bunch of people into exile. They misdirect our attention from where this kind of sexual violence is really happening and why it's happening. And why it's happening is because in part, not entirely, but in part because our institutions allow it to happen. Pretty clear consensus that long sentences do not clearly reduce recidivism. At least there's no clear evidence of that. There's fairly good evidence now that civil commitment has minimal effect, even on recidivism. No measurable impact on incidence of sexual assault. Yet it costs a huge amount of money and diverts resources away from other things like sexual assault services. Is SORN, sex offender registration notification, effective? Well, some mixed results on reduction in recidivism. Some studies have found some deterrent effect from notification laws in particular. Definitely found some negative effects on criminal justice system behavior. And clear statistical evidence of perverse increase in recidivism from the more aggressive laws. So one of the key ideas here is that these are not do no harm laws. These are not, well, let's try it and see if it works. After all, what harm can we do if we prevent at least one, even one sexual crime? Isn't that a good thing? The answer is, even if you discount the pain you're causing to many, many people, the answer is no, these laws may have perverse and harmful effects by actually increasing recidivism. So notification, as I say, may increase recidivism. Second, potential perverse effect. Again, not proven, but raised by quite a number of people, including ACSOL and so forth. And that is, has the advent of these very aggressive draconian laws depressed reporting of sexual abuse? We know that reporting of sexual crimes is among the lowest of all violent crimes, and it's a problem. The theory is that, particularly with non-stranger sexual assault, intimate, that the very, very harsh consequences may actually suppress reporting. And I'm not aware of any clear empirical evidence on this, but I've done some tracing of reporting of sexual assault by strangers versus non-strangers. The dark blue line is stranger reporting, percent reporting. The light blue line is non-stranger. In general, non-stranger reporting is less than stranger reporting for probably the very reasons that I said. And the concerning thing to me is what you see on the trend lines on the right-hand side of the chart, which is that, that there's been a separation. That around 2010, you start to see a decrease in non-stranger reporting with a fairly constant stranger reporting, suggesting, in my mind anyway, that these laws, these draconian laws, are having a greater depression effect on reporting among victims of non-stranger assault. Residency restrictions, again, we know this is one of the key areas where, as far as I know, there's almost unanimous agreement among experts that these laws are not useful and actually have a detrimental effect on reentry and therefore successful reentry. Key study in Minnesota tracking 244 sexual offenses. Not one of them would have been prevented by residential restrictions. There's a large consensus among law enforcement people, district attorneys, and criminologists that these laws are bad and harmful, yet they keep getting passed. So, let me talk a little bit about alternatives. So what we've seen is a great focus on what some people would call tertiary responses. These are responses aimed at people who've already offended and maybe already offended several times. And again, the idea is let's figure out who the dangerous people are and keep them away from us. So one of the things that then gets somewhat ignored there are standard correctional tools, which I won't get into, but there's a fair amount of suggestion that properly done, using this risk needs responsivity approach, standard correctional tools, correctional treatment, supervision can have a salutary effect in reducing reoffending, helping people reintegrate. Properly done supervision and treatment can be beneficial. As I'll mention, there are some promising programs like COSA, Circles of Support and Accountability, and then the public health approach that I'll talk about. So one of the huge, in my opinion, one of the downfalls of our current policy is that it's non-empirical. It's not an atheoretical. It's not based on any set of comprehensive or coherent ideas about what leads to sexual assault and what might address it. And one of the things that's missing is any kind of emphasis on evaluating programs, understanding what works, and replicating what works, and abandoning what doesn't work. And that's not just to save money, that's to save lives and crimes. So just a couple of examples of that. This idea of circles of support, it comes out of Canada. It's a way of welcoming people out of a correctional setting back into the community, providing support and accountability. The Canadians have had great luck with it. Does it work? Well, that's an empirical question, and a pretty rigorous study, randomized controlled trial in Minnesota, suggests that it does work, that it reduces the risk of recidivism. So, I'll talk a little bit more about another program. I guess that slide is further down. But many people suggest a public health approach to dealing with sexual violence. So what are the ideas of a public health approach? Comprehensive and systematic. It's not a bunch of reactionary policies, not just trying to close this loophole or that loophole. It's making use of a comprehensive approach to sexual violence, uses primary, secondary, and tertiary approaches. Primary meaning trying to figure out what the root causes are and address those causes so that the violence doesn't happen in the first place. It's evidence-based. It's based on continuing assessment and evaluation and replicating best practices. So again, I've mentioned that the COSA study that I just mentioned is one example of that. There's another study that is fairly recent by Charlene Sen, a Canadian researcher who worked with, in a university setting, developing a program to reduce the incidence of sexual assault among university students. And again, this is a rigorous study, controlled and so forth, and she reports a reduction in the incidence of of sexual assault in the order of about 50%. So very, very significant reduction. When you think about it, huge numbers of assaults prevented, but mostly based on research. But she says, and this is, again, a key part of the problem, most campuses use programs that have never been formally evaluated or have not proved to be effective in reducing the incidence of sexual assault. So we can start moving to better programs by providing resources for evaluation and replication. So, sorry. Wait a second. Go back up here. Yeah. So, what can we do to change this? Well, obviously, very complicated. Telling stories, narratives, changing people's hearts, all important. But I think that we need to change a fundamental frame here. And the frame has to change from who are the most dangerous people, let's identify them and get them away from us, to how can we prevent the most violence. We need to identify and recognize the false frames that we've been using. These ideas that we spare no expense. If only one child is saved, it's worth it. We need to close the loopholes. These are false ideas. We do spare expense all the time. And by claiming that we spare no expense to prevent the next crime, we're making invisible the crimes that we never pay attention to. If only one child is saved, it's worth it. It ignores the perverse consequences that these laws have on reintegration, on recidivism themselves, as well as the harm they cause to registrants and their families. We need to close the loopholes. No, this isn't a problem of loopholes. This is a problem of addressing a comprehensive problem comprehensively. So that's my presentation. I don't know, how many of you have seen the movie Untouchable? Is that something that you've seen? Okay, I recommend the film highly because it addresses these problems both from a storytelling perspective, telling the stories of people involved, but also from an empirical perspective. And then it's on it streams on Amazon, and it's worthwhile watching, and I think it's more people should see it. And there are many, many things written about this, but some of these ideas that I've been talking about are in my book. So I'm happy for questions if you want. Or
if you want, we do have a few minutes, about 7 or 8, for anybody that might have a question of the professor. Yes, sir.
I certainly commend your approach on this, and all the things that you say absolutely need to be done. But in addition to that, isn't it also necessary to reframe the definition of what is seen as sexual assault or a sexual crime? Because in the case of certainly a term like statutory rape, where it is something that might be behavior done between teenagers willingly, and yet that is defined in the same way as a violent crime. And so it seems to me that that context has to be foremost in mind to distinguish something that is basically in many cultures and many other countries would not even be defined as against the law. And in the context that these are willing exchanges, especially among teenagers, just doing what teenagers do, and aren't we criminalizing an entire generation by continuing these policies?
yeah, I think that you're raising a good point. I would distinguish between the need to refine the definition of what sexual assault is. I'm not saying we don't need to do that, and it may be, versus understanding that the term sex offender is an suggests an undifferentiated, homogeneous group, and that it is wrong and bad policy to include a bunch of people with different circumstances under that blanket term, in the sense that all of those people get the same consequences. I mean, that is nonsensical. It's also ineffective. It violates the principle of risk, need, responsivity, and so forth. So on that point, definitely, I agree with you.
And a question in the back?
Yeah, I was curious if you could comment. You showed the amount of time been increasing in prison, and then victim advocates would say, well, the victim has a lifetime sentence. But we seem to have created a culture, and these laws seem to perpetuate it, in which we really don't want the victim to forget. Does that make sense? I mean, a good example is child porn, where they tell the victim every time they find pictures, they remind her of it. Well, isn't that re-victimizing her by the culture that we're creating? I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I haven't thought in particular about that. I do think that that's kind of what I mean by thinking about the consequences of the laws that we passed, because none of these laws kind of operates in a little isolation. And it's kind of like, if you think of these laws as we're going to plug this loophole and plug that loophole, then you don't think of the broader issue. So I think I would include that in the idea that we ought to be thinking comprehensively about this. We ought to be thinking about, among other things, what actually is good for victims.
Right, exactly.
And what is actually good for preventing future victims.
Well put. Yes, sir.
Most of our discussion appears to be about hands-on. And in my experience in prisons, most are guilty of underage porn possession. Most of it teenage porn. And yet I rarely hear this discussed. Our discussion always seems to confuse and conflate the two, or not discuss underage porn at all, and how we can solve the problem of making people think that everybody who's looked at something or pressed the button to possess it is some horrible, awful person.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I don't have any brilliant ideas about that, but it goes along with the idea that we've created this catch-all phrase, sex offender, that applies to a whole category of people from many, many different backgrounds. But let me just say one thing about that, and that is that these laws are based on, and I'm not meaning this as a response to your question, but it just made me think about this, that these laws are based on the idea that there's a group of people who have degraded legal status, who are less than full civic persons. And that is an abhorrent idea, but one that's totally familiar in our liberal democracy in the U.S. I mean, we've always had a group of people that are out. It's just changed over time. So I want to caution all of us from number one, saying, look, the category sex offender is an undifferentiated whole. It's a heterogeneous group, but let's be careful not to say, and this group over here does fall into that category of degraded other. It's just not us, So I think that it's hard. And again, it's not a direct response to your question, but just something that I think is important to keep in mind is that we have to get over that notion, we, meaning all our country, that there's some group of people who are not entitled to the same legal protections and dignity as everybody else.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
This gentleman has been saying this.
We talked about education being an essential part of solving some of these problems. Contrary to that, we have these companies that commercialize our existence on the internet and keep promoting continuously, proliferating, and then they don't give the full story of what's being presented just to terrorize the community and further create anguish
it's, I'm sure it was a predictable consequence of these laws, that was going to happen. We're an entrepreneurial nation. And, to me, one of the interesting things, I think Janus's presentation mentioned, the Millard case out of Colorado. And one of the, I thought, great aspects of the judge's ruling in that case was that he understood and acknowledged the fact that the harm to people comes not simply from the registry, but from these kind of things that you're talking about, the proliferation for commercial ends of the information.
Well, everybody, let's give a... We are so indeed lucky and blessed to have someone like Professor Janus come to our conference and to educate us. I found his presentation to be compelling, quite frankly. So I will tell you this is the time to leave this lovely room and to move upstairs. We have